There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself with tears or dramatic breakdowns. It arrives quietly, like fog rolling in off a cold river, settling into the spaces between your ribs and making itself at home. It is the loneliness of existing in a world that has decided, without asking you, that you do not quite belong. And if you have ever felt that specific ache, if you have ever stood in a crowded room and understood with bone-deep certainty that not a single person there truly sees you, then this story is going to reach inside your chest and hold something very tender. So before we begin, if you are new here, please consider subscribing and leaving a like on this video, because the stories we tell in this space are crafted for exactly the kind of soul who needs to hear them. Now settle in, because what happened to Serafina Voss on the night of the autumn equinox is the kind of story that does not let you go. Ashvale was the sort of city that wore its history like an old coat, familiar and heavy and slightly worn at the elbows. Built over the ruins of what historians called the First Territory, it sat at the confluence of 3 rivers in a valley that the surrounding mountains had cupped like careful hands for millennia. The modern buildings of glass and steel rose above streets that still followed the original paths carved by wolf paws 3 centuries ago. And if you knew where to look, you could press your palm against certain walls and feel something ancient humming beneath the mortar, something that remembered. The werewolf community had evolved considerably since the old days. The brutal hierarchy of the First Territory, with its blood-earned rankings and its merciless enforcement of Omega subjugation, had given way to something that called itself a meritocracy, that dressed itself in progressive language and council-approved charters, and that still, when you scraped the surface, operated on the same fundamental principle that had always governed pack society. Some lives mattered more than others, and the system decided which ones. Serafina Voss had learned this truth, not in any dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of 1,000 small moments across 24 years of living. She had learned it the first time her mother looked at her with that particular mixture of love and disappointment that parents reserve for children who fail to be what they needed. She had learned it when the pack healers, after their examination, had written in her official file the words that would follow her everywhere: Omega classification, instinct dormant, bonding incompatible. She had learned it when her father, a beta of modest standing but genuine ambition, had sat her down at 17 and explained, with what she could tell he believed was kindness, that he and her mother were relocating to join her uncle's pack in the Northern Territories, and that, given her classification, it would be better for everyone if she remained behind. Better for everyone. She had turned those 3 words over in her mind so many times in the years since that they had worn smooth, like river stones, like something she could hold without cutting herself. She lived alone in a studio apartment above the city archive where she worked, a fact that the archive director, old Master Fenwick, had arranged with characteristic gruff practicality when she had come to him at 17 with excellent credentials and nowhere to sleep. The archive was a converted stone building that had once been, according to records Serafina knew better than anyone, a meeting hall of the First Territory, a place where alphas had gathered to make decisions that shaped the lives of hundreds. Now it housed 43,000 documents, 912 historical artifacts, and 1 young woman who spent her days cataloging the past and her evenings reading it. Serafina was good at her work, in the way that people who have nowhere else to put their devotion tend to be extraordinary at things. She knew the archive the way some people know beloved faces, every crease and corner, every drawer that stuck on humid days, every document that needed to be handled with gloves because the ink was still reactive after all these years. And she knew, better than any scholar or historian in Ashvale, the true history of the man the city had built its civic mythology around. Alpha Kale of the First Territory, the Sealed One, the Forgotten Guardian. He had acquired many names in 3 centuries, as legends tend to do, gathering titles the way rivers gather sediment, layering meaning upon meaning until the original shape of the thing is obscured. The official story, the one taught in schools and commemorated with a modest plaque near the eastern gate, was simple and satisfying in the way official stories tend to be. 300 years ago, An alpha of extraordinary power had given his life to seal a corrupting darkness that threatened all of Ashvale, and the city had been safe ever since. Hero, sacrifice, safety, the end. But Seraphina had read the actual documents, the ones written in the weeks and months surrounding his death, the private correspondence, the healer records, the territorial logs written in handwriting that grew increasingly desperate as the events unfolded. And the Kyle she had come to know through those fragile Browning pages was not the gleaming legend of the civic plaque. He was someone considerably more interesting and considerably more real. The Temple of the Sealed One sat at the far eastern edge of Ashvale, where the city's confident urban sprawl gave way to older ground, to moss-covered stones and trees that had been growing for longer than the city itself had existed. It was not an impressive structure. That was perhaps the most striking thing about it. Ashvale had grander religious sites, newer ones with proper maintenance budgets and congregations and gift shops near the entrance. The Temple of Kale was small and perpetually slightly damp, its stone walls darkened by centuries of weather, its single interior space lit by whatever candles the occasional curious visitor left, and the light that filtered through two high, narrow windows. The council had never bothered to officially de-sanctify it, which would have required acknowledging it enough to pass a vote, and so it existed in an administrative limbo that meant nobody maintained it, and nobody particularly visited it either, which suited Seraphina perfectly. She had first come here at 18, 6 months after her family left, on a night when the loneliness had been so large that her apartment walls could not contain it. She had walked without particular destination and found herself at the temple almost by accident, drawn by something she did not then understand and could not now fully articulate. She had sat on the cold stone floor, and because there was no one to hear her, and because the document she had spent that week cataloging had made Kale feel strangely present in her mind, she had spoken aloud to the darkness. Not a prayer, exactly, not in any traditional religious sense. More like talking to someone she had been reading about so extensively that they had begun to feel like someone she knew. She had said something like, "I read your letters today, the ones you wrote to the healer Maris before the sealing. You were frightened. I think that matters, that you were frightened. And you did it anyway. That seems important." And then, because the silence had felt less empty after speaking into it, she had come back the next night, and the night after that. 6 years later, it was simply part of her life, as natural and necessary as sleep. Every evening, after the archive closed and Master Fenwick shuffled off to his cottage behind the building, Seraphina walked the 12 minutes to the temple, sat in her usual spot near the eastern wall, where the stone held a slight warmth even on cold nights, and talked. She talked about what she had found in the archive that day, new documents uncovered, old ones re-examined in different light. She talked about the city and its politics and the council, and the way she saw the system grinding people down who were not positioned to push back. She talked occasionally about her own life, about loneliness and small joys, about a cat she had fed 3 days in a row who had eventually stopped coming, about a dream she'd had that she couldn't quite shake. She did not expect answers. She had never expected answers. The talking itself was the point, the practice of turning inward experience into spoken words and releasing them into a space that felt, somehow, less hostile than the rest of the world. What Seraphina did not know, could not know, was that the space inside the Temple of the Sealed One was not empty. It had not been empty for 3 centuries. Kale had not expected the sealing to feel like this. He had known, in the way one knows things one has prepared for intellectually without fully grasping emotionally, that sealing himself with the corruption would mean a kind of death, but death, he had assumed, would mean absence, nothingness, the simple cessation of being that every creature who had ever lived eventually entered. What he had not anticipated, what no one had told him because no one had ever done this particular thing before, was that the seal required his consciousness to persist as a counterweight. The corruption he had trapped within the boundary of the old territorial magic was not passive. It pushed, constantly, against the edges of its confinement, testing, probing, applying pressure in ways that were not physical, but that required a continuous, conscious resistance. And so Kyle had persisted. Not alive. Not dead. Something that had no precise name in any language he knew. A sustained awareness maintained by will and by the nature of the magic itself, witness to everything that changed in the world above while being unable to touch any of it. 300 years is a very long time to be a witness without being seen. He had watched Ashvale grow from the scattered wooden buildings of the early post-territory period into the sprawling city it had become. He had watched generations of alphas consolidate power and call it progress. He had watched the Omega population, whose liberation from the worst of First Territory practices had been the thing he cared most about, the reform that had cost him the most political capital in his own time, gradually find themselves constrained again by new mechanisms that accomplish the same subjugation with better justification. He had watched the council he had helped establish become the thing he had feared most, an institution that served itself. He had watched all of this with the particular helpless clarity of someone who cannot intervene, who can only observe, who has all the context and none of the agency. And he had grown tired. Not in the way that living beings grow tired. Not in any way that could be remedied by rest. A deeper kind of weariness. The exhaustion of a consciousness that had been straining at the same task for longer than most civilizations last. The fatigue of caring without the ability to act. He had begun, in the last several decades, to notice his awareness fraying at the edges, his hold on the corruption growing thinner in ways that frightened him. Not for himself, but for the city above, for the people who did not know what was buried beneath their streets. He had heard voices before, of course. The temple was not entirely unvisited. Scholars came occasionally to take notes on the carvings. Children dared each other to spend a minute inside after dark. Once, a group of young alphas had used the space for what appeared to be some kind of initiation ritual that Cale had found both ritually incoherent and personally offensive. He had learned over centuries to mostly tune out the surface noise, the way one learns to sleep despite sounds that initially seemed impossible to sleep through. He had learned to compress his awareness, to hold himself very still and very small, expending as little as possible, saving his resistance for the corruption that never stopped testing. And then, 6 years ago, a young woman had sat down near the eastern wall and started talking to him. She had not known she was talking to him. That was one of the things that had initially caught his attention. Most people who came to the temple, the religious ones, the curious ones, the ones seeking something they could not name, oriented themselves toward the altar, or the carvings, or some vague sense of sacred space. This woman had sat down like someone settling into a chair they had used 1,000 times, with no performance and no particular reverence, and she had spoken the way people speak when they are genuinely alone, with the specific cadence of someone, processing out loud. And what she had said had reached him in a way no voice had reached him in 3 centuries. I read your letters today, the ones you wrote to the healer Maris before the sealing. You were frightened. I think that matters. He had not been certain, at first, that he had truly perceived it, or that he was not simply constructing it from the longing to be perceived that had accumulated over 300 years. He had held very still and listened, and she had kept talking about the documents she had found, about what they revealed about who he had actually been, about the gap between the legend and the historical record. She spoke of him with an attention that was scholarly and somehow also intimate, the attention of someone who had spent real time with the material of a life and come to care about the person that material implied. And Cale, who had been braced against the cold indifference of 3 centuries, felt something shift. She came back the next night, and the next. Each time, she spoke with the same quality of genuine address, not performing devotion, not seeking favors or intercession, simply sharing what was in her mind with the assumption that there was something in this space worth sharing with. And with each visit, the quality of his attention to her sharpened. He began to recognize the particular rhythm of her voice, the way she organized her thoughts, the subjects that clearly cost her more than she let on in the phrasing, but revealed themselves in the brief silences before she spoke. He learned her, the way he had once learned territory, by careful attention over time. In those 6 years, through the private, one-sided conversations of a woman talking to history in an empty temple, Kyle had come to know Serafina Voss better than anyone living knew her. And that was not a comfortable thing to know, because it meant that when the night of the autumn equinox arrived, the 300th anniversary of his sealing, and the corruption below gave its most powerful surge yet, cracking something fundamental in the barrier he had maintained for 3 centuries, and he felt the boundary between his awareness and the world above thin to something almost permeable. The first thing he thought was not of duty or legacy or the city he had died for. The first thing he thought was her name. Serafina arrived at the temple that evening, as she always did, with a thermos of tea going cold in her bag and a head full of the day's discoveries. She had spent the afternoon with a collection of documents she had never had cause to examine closely before. Correspondence from the Council of Kale's era, the political maneuvering that had surrounded the decision to attempt the sealing at all. It had made for illuminating and somewhat disturbing reading, and she was still turning it over as she settled into her spot near the eastern wall and wrapped her hands around the thermos for warmth. "I found something today," she said too. "The familiar darkness. Something that changes the picture a bit. Or maybe just fills it in. The council in your time knew more about what the sealing would cost you personally than the official records acknowledge. They knew you would not survive it in any conventional sense. And there were 3 votes against proceeding, and those 3 council members were removed from their positions within a month of the sealing. I do not think that was coincidence." She paused, because she could feel the emotion that came with this discovery moving through her. A retroactive anger on behalf of a man 3 centuries dead. "You were not just a hero, Kale. You were convenient, and I find that I am furious about it in a way that is probably disproportionate, given that you have been dead for 300 years, and cannot be further harmed by my knowing." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though I suppose that is one advantage of your situation. "Nothing I say can hurt you." The silence that followed was the same silence it had always been. She sipped her tea and let her thoughts continue their quiet procession. She talked for another 20 minutes, about smaller things, about a letter she had drafted to her mother that she would probably not send, about the cat she had seen again near the archive entrance, about the quality of the light in the valley that afternoon, when the autumn sun had come through clouds at a particular angle and made everything look briefly like the illuminated manuscripts she loved. She talked until the thermos was empty, and the candles she had brought were burning low, and she was ready to begin the walk home. She stood and brushed stone dust from her coat, as she always did. She looked toward the altar with its worn carvings, as she always did, a gesture that was not quite a bow and not quite a nod, but something in between. A private ritual that meant something only to her. She said, as she had said every night for 6 years without variation, "Good night, Kale. Thank you for being here." And then she heard it, not with her ears exactly. It was a sensation that bypassed the physical mechanism of hearing and arrived somewhere closer to the center of her, like the feeling of a voice remembered rather than a voice received. 2 words, low and rough with something that sounded like disuse, like a thing that had not happened in a very long time and was happening now with great effort and greater uncertainty. "I am." Serafina stood completely still. The candle flames did not move. The night outside the narrow windows continued its indifferent business. Nothing in the temple had changed, and everything in it had changed. And she stood in the gap between those 2 facts, and did not breathe. "I am," the not voice said again. And this time, it carried something she recognized, despite having no frame of reference for it. Something that sounded like relief, so old it had almost become a different emotion entirely. "Here. I have been here." Serafina's thermos hit the stone floor. She did not notice. She did not run. That surprised her later, when she had enough distance to think about it. Every reasonable instinct should have sent her fleeing into the autumn night, should have propelled her back through the city streets to her apartment where she could lock the door and spend the next several days convincing herself that stress and loneliness and an overactive scholarly imagination had conspired to produce an auditory hallucination in a cold, dark temple. She did not run. She stood there with her thermos on the floor, and her heart doing something entirely unreasonable in her chest. And after a very long moment, she said, with a steadiness that she would never be able to fully account for, "Hello?" The pause that followed lasted long enough that she began to wonder if she had imagined it after all. If the reasonable explanation was in fact the correct one, and she was simply a young woman alone in the Sao, dark talking to stone. And then, "You can hear me." Not a question. Something between wonder and something much older than wonder. "I appear to be able to hear you," Serafina said, with the slightly detached precision she applied to situations she did not yet have a framework for. "Is that unusual?" Another pause, shorter this time. "In 300 years, you are the first." She sat back down, not because she had consciously decided to, but because her legs made the decision for her, and she had learned long ago to follow her body's wisdom when her mind was otherwise occupied with being completely overwhelmed. She sat, and she breathed, and she looked at the middle distance where nothing was visible, but where, somehow, she knew to look. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I have been talking to you for 6 years, and now that there is apparently something to say back to, I find I am at a loss. What might have been a sound that was almost a sound, the ghost of something that would have been a low breath of almost laughter if it had belonged to a living person, moved through the quality of the air. You talked about my letters," the not voice said. "The ones to Maris. You were the first person to say that my fear mattered." She felt something catch in her throat. "It did matter. It does." She folded her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. "How is this possible? I mean that as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. I have read everything in the archive about the ceiling, and none of it suggested that you would persist, because none of the people who wrote those records knew," he said. And the words came more easily now, as though speaking was a skill being rapidly relearned. "The ceiling required a consciousness to maintain the binding. I did not know this until after it was done, and I was already here. Trapped, not dead. A distinction that matters more on some nights than others. 300 years. The number arrived in Naumtsetun, her mind with its full weight, for perhaps the first time. She had known it intellectually, had written it herself in catalog entries and historical summaries, but to have it spoken by the person to whom those 300 years had happened, rendered it suddenly physical, a thing with mass and dimension. 300 years, she said softly. "I am so sorry." "Do not apologize," he said. And there was an edge to it that was not unkind, but was firm, a reflex perhaps, the remnant of an alpha who had spent his life navigating the political complexities of when to accept and when to refuse what was offered. "You did nothing. And your visits have been—" He stopped, started again. "They have been something I looked forward to, in circumstances where there was very little to look forward to. That is not a small thing." Serafina absorbed this. She thought about 6 years of evenings in this temple. Talking to what she had told herself was simply a practice, a habit, a way of working through her thoughts using the absent audience of a historical figure to organize them. She thought about how she had chosen this place, this specific address in the form of a dead alpha's name, as the recipient of things she told no living person. And she thought about what it meant that those offerings had landed somewhere, had been received, had meant something to the one who received them. "You know a great deal about me," she said slowly. "Yes." "That is somewhat unsettling." "I imagine it is," he agreed. And there was something almost careful in it, an awareness that what he was about to say required careful handling. "I want you to understand that I did not seek it. You came to me, or to the space I occupy. And I listened because you were the only voice that—" He paused again, and she had the sense that what was difficult was not finding words, but choosing which true ones to offer, because you were the only voice that addressed me as though you thought I might be worth addressing, even when you thought no one was listening. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wind had come up, moving through the old trees that bordered the temple grounds, and its sound came through the narrow windows like a presence of its own. "What do you know about me?" she asked. "What has 6 years of listening taught you? That you are alone in ways that are not entirely your choice," he said. "That you are considerably more capable of bearing loneliness than you should have to be. That you are angry at injustice in ways you express as academic observations, because you have learned it is safer that way. That you love your work with a sincerity that I find. And I am aware this is a strange word for something I can only observe from a great distance, moving. That you talk to a dead alpha every night because the silence of this space feels less hostile than the silence of your apartment, and because you have found, through documents and letters and the particular archaeology of trying to understand a life from its traces, something in me worth speaking to." A pause. "And you deserve to know that I am aware, more than perhaps you would be comfortable knowing, how much it has cost you to choose the quality of connection you have found here over the easier, but more damaging kind that the world outside has offered." Serafina felt tears arrive without warning, the specific kind that have nothing to do with sadness, and everything to do with being unexpectedly, precisely seen. She pressed her fingers to the corners of her eyes with the firm practicality of someone who was not going to cry in front of a 3-century-old spirit and make the situation any more dramatic than it already was. "You are very perceptive," she managed, "for someone who cannot technically see anything. 300 years of listening teaches a great deal about what people reveal without intending to." She laughed, and the sound startled her with its realness, its ordinariness in this extraordinary moment. "Right. Well," she pulled her coat more closely around her, "I think we need to have a considerably longer conversation. But it is quite late, and I am, it turns out, rather destabilized. And I think I should go home and sleep and return tomorrow evening with better capacity for processing what is happening." She looked again toward that middle distance. "Will you be here tomorrow?" The pause this time was very brief. "I have been here for 300 years, he said. "I will be here tomorrow." "Good," she said. She picked up her thermos from the floor. She looked at the altar and said, as she always did, "Good night, Kyle." But this time, there was nothing ritual about it. This time it was addressed to someone who would hear it. "Good night, Serafina," said the not voice. And she walked home in the autumn night with her heart doing something she did not have a word for. And behind her, in the old temple with its damp stones and its narrow windows, a consciousness that had been holding itself compressed and careful for 3 centuries, allowed itself, for the first time, to fully expand. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the studio apartment above the archive and watched the ceiling and thought with the disciplined precision she brought to difficult research problems, setting aside the emotional component as a variable to be examined separately and focusing first on what she actually knew. She knew that she had heard a voice. She knew that the voice had known things about her that would have been impossible to know through any mechanism she could account for other than exactly what he had described. She knew that the temple had felt different tonight. Not frightening, not threatening, but charged in a way that was distinct from its usual quality of dense and quiet age. She knew that her response had been, improbably, not terror, but something that felt dangerously like recognition. She also knew, because she had spent years reading everything the archive contained about the ceiling, that there was a piece of the historical record she had always found troubling, a section in the primary account written by the pack healer who witnessed the ritual that described the seal not as a death, but as a binding, a term that in First Territory magical tradition had specific meaning. A binding required both the thing being bound and the thing doing the binding to persist in some form. She had always read this as metaphorical, as the magic itself persisting in the landscape. But if the binding required a consciousness rather than simply a force, if Kale himself had been required to remain present as the active principle of the seal, then what had happened tonight was not a ghost story. It was not supernatural in any cheap or frightening sense. It was simply a fact of how the sealing had worked, an aspect of the historical record that had been inaccurately documented or deliberately obscured. She reached for the notebook on her bedside table and wrote for 2 hours, because writing helped her think, and because there was a great deal to think about. By the time the archive opened at 9 the following morning, Serafina had drafted 14 questions she intended to ask Kyle when she returned to the temple that evening. organized a new research agenda around the gaps in the historical documentation of the ceiling's mechanics, and arrived at 3 separate, emotional conclusions that she immediately set aside to be examined at a more appropriate time. Master Fenwick, who had known her for 6 years and had developed a fine-tuned sensitivity to the difference between her ordinary focused state and her extraordinary focused state, looked at her for approximately 4 seconds when she arrived and said, "What have you found?" with the eagerness of an old archivist who has never entirely stopped hoping for significant discoveries. "I am not entirely sure yet," she said truthfully. "Can I have access to the sealing period primary documents? The full collection, including the restricted sections?" Master Fenwick raised an eyebrow. The restricted sections of the sealing period collection were restricted not because they contained anything dangerous, but because they were fragile, and because the Council had, at some point in the distant past, added a nominal layer of bureaucratic oversight to their access that had never been removed. He was the only one who could authorize access, and he did so now without ceremony, because he trusted her hands with the documents the way he trusted few other things. "Third cabinet on the left," he said. "The key is on my desk." What Serafina found in those restricted documents confirmed several things she had suspected, and revealed several more she had not. The primary healer's account, which she had read before only in a later transcription, was in the original handwriting considerably more specific about what the binding required. The word she had previously read as sustained in the transcription was in fact sentient. The seal required a sentient anchor. This was not a small distinction. And in the margins of this document, in handwriting that matched none of the known contributors to the record, someone had written 3 words in the old territorial script that Serafina could read, because she had spent 2 years learning it specifically so she could access documents in that language. The 3 words translated roughly as, "He hears everything." Someone had known. Someone, in the weeks or months after the sealing, had known what Cale's condition was, had known he was aware and present, and had written that knowledge in the margin of a document, and then presumably said nothing else about it, because nothing else about it appeared anywhere in the official record. She photographed the marginal note with the archive's document camera, and sat very still for a moment with the feeling of being on the edge of something much larger than she had initially thought. She returned to the temple that evening 2 hours earlier than usual, with her notebook and 3 new candles, and the particular quality of alertness that good research produces. He was there, of course. She felt it the moment she crossed the threshold, the way the quality of the silence in the room was not quite empty, the way it had a texture it did not have in the ordinary world outside. She sat in her spot and said, without preamble, "Someone knew. Several people knew," Cale said, and his voice came more easily tonight, less effortful, as though the previous night had been a bridge, and tonight they were already across it. The healer Maris knew. One of the council members who voted against the sealing knew, because she was the one who thought to include the question of the anchor's nature in the negotiations, and it was her marginal note you found. A pause. "You found her marginal note." "I did. This morning?" Serafina opened her notebook. "She wrote that you could hear everything, which means she understood what the seal had done to you, and she apparently told no one in any official capacity. She came to the temple," Cale said, "approximately 4 months after the sealing. She stood exactly where you are sitting now, and she said, 'I know you are there, and I know you can hear me, and I am sorry. I believe this was wrong. I voted against it. I was overruled.' And then she wept for a very long time, and she never came back." He paused. "She was removed from the council 11 days after the sealing. She died 14 years later. I do not know what became of her family." Serafina wrote this down with the focused efficiency of someone filing information and then looked up. Why did no one come after her? If she knew, surely others. Because it was not convenient for others to know, Kyle said, with a flatness that carried 3 centuries of watching. If the city believed the sealed one was dead, he was a hero and a symbol. If the city knew the sealed one was alive and aware and trapped beneath their streets, he was a problem, a responsibility, something that would require addressing. He paused. The council that overruled Maris's colleague was the same council that had arranged for the sealing in the first place with imperfect information about what it would require. Acknowledging that they had condemned their most powerful alpha to an existence rather than a death would have been politically catastrophic. So they did not acknowledge it. Serafina stared at the middle distance for a long moment. The anger she had felt the previous evening, the retroactive fury on his behalf, returned with interest. "That is," she said carefully, "one of the most egregious things I have read evidence of in 6 years of working with historical atrocities. And I work with a significant amount of historical atrocity on a professional basis. Something in the quality of the..." Air shifted in a way she was already learning to interpret as his version of acknowledgement, a resonance rather than a sound. "I appreciate your anger on my behalf," he said, "though I have had considerable time to make my peace with the facts of it." "Have you?" She looked directly at the space where she felt him most present. "Made your peace with it?" A pause that was longer than the others. "I have had 300 years to practice," he said finally. "That is not the same thing." And there, it was, the crack in the careful surface, the thing that 300 years of practiced endurance had not fully covered. Serafina felt it arrive in the room like a shift in temperature, and she responded to it the way she responded to all things she recognized as significant and fragile, with attention that was quiet and complete. "No," she said, "I don't suppose it is. If you are finding this story as affecting as I believe you might be, I want to pause for just a moment and ask you to please leave a comment below about what you think of Serafina and Kale so far. Stories like this one exist because of communities who show up for them, so your engagement truly matters. Drop a like if you want to make sure the algorithm knows this story deserves to be found. And now let us continue, because the conversation between a living archivist and a 3-century-old spirit is only just beginning to get complicated. They talked every evening after that. The conversations evolved quickly, from the careful, exploratory exchange of the first night into something considerably denser and more ranging. Kale had 300 years of observation to share, and Serafina had 6 years of research to offer, and between them, they were reconstructing a history that the official record had deliberately obscured. She brought documents to the temple and read passages to him, and he confirmed or corrected or contextualized based on things he had witnessed directly. She told him on the 5th evening, essentially conducting the most unusual oral history project in the history of archival science. "I am aware," he said, with that quality in his voice that she had come to recognize as dry humor, an unexpected aspect of his personality that the historical documents had given very little indication of. "I find I do not mind being a research subject if the researcher is you. You are not only a research subject," she said, with more firmness than she had intended. And then, when the weight of what that meant settled over the exchange, with more quiet, "You are also someone I have been talking to for 6 years, and who has apparently been listening. That is a different category." "Yes," he said. Just that. But the way he said it made the word carry considerably more than its syllable. What she was learning about Kyle, the actual Kale rather than the legend, was complicated in the ways that real people are complicated. He had been in life a significant presence, powerful, and strategic and accustomed to authority in ways that he was honestly self-aware about and honestly uncertain about in equal measure. He had held strong beliefs about justice and had acted on those beliefs in ways that cost him substantially. And he had also held the blind spots of his class and his era and his status in ways that he had begun, over 3 centuries of witnessing, to identify and reckon with. He was not the unblemished hero. He was also not simply a product of his worst decisions. He was someone who had spent 300 years thinking, which had the effect of producing both considerable wisdom and considerable regret in roughly equal measure. He was also, she was discovering, someone who found it profoundly difficult to not know what was happening. The corruption beneath the seal, which he described with careful precision as a sentient malevolence that had existed in this valley far longer than werewolves had been quiet for most of the centuries since. The sealing but had begun, in recent decades, to show signs of renewed activity. On the night of the autumn equinox, the anniversary of his sacrifice, It had surged powerfully enough to crack something in the binding, a crack that had apparently thinned the barrier between his awareness and the world above, enough to allow her to hear him. But a crack was also a crack, and the seal was not what it had been. "How long?" she asked him, on the 7th evening. She did not specify what she was asking. About, but she knew he understood. "I do not know precisely," he said. "The crack is not widening quickly, but it is widening." A pause. "And there is something else I need to tell you. Something that was not in the terms, as I understood them when the sealing was done. Or if it was not explained to me in a way that I grasped." She set down her notebook. "Tell me. The sealing requires, as I have said, a sentient anchor. What I did not understand, or did not understand fully, is that an anchor is not indefinitely self-sustaining. The binding was designed to be renewed, at intervals, by a willing soul in the world above, making a connection with the anchor that is strong enough to transfer energy into the binding." He paused. This was, presumably, supposed to happen through the temple and its worshippers. When the temple fell into disuse, when the visits became rare, and the connection between the city and what lay beneath it was allowed to become mostly symbolic, the binding weakened, and has continued to weaken. Serafina was very still. So the corruption strengthening is not simply a natural deterioration of the seal's magic. No, it has been accelerated by the fact that the seal was never renewed as it was designed to be. Because the council allowed the temple to fall into disuse. Because the truth of what the sealing was and what it required was buried to protect political interests, he said, with 300 years of quiet anger. Yes, she sat with that for a moment. Then, and what would renewal require? Now, at this point, another pause, longer than the previous ones, with a quality she was learning to recognize as him choosing his words with particular care. "A soul bond," he said. "Voluntary, between a living person and the anchor. A connection strong enough to transfer life force into the binding and re-establish its integrity." He stopped, started again. "I am aware of what I am describing, Serafina. I am aware of what it would mean for the person who undertook it. I am telling you because you deserve to have the complete information, not because I am asking you for anything." She looked at the middle distance. "But I am the obvious candidate," she said, "given that I am the only person who can hear you." "You are currently the only person who can hear me," he said carefully. "That may not be permanent, given the state of the crack in the seal, but yes, currently. And if the seal is not renewed, the corruption will eventually break free. Its nature is to corrupt and expand. Ashvale would be, over time, significantly harmed." How significantly? A pause that she felt in her bones. "I have been watching it work at the edges of the seal for 3 centuries, Serafina. If it breaks free in full, the word significantly would be inadequate." She closed her notebook. She put it in her bag. She sat in the candlelight and the old stone, and the presence of him, and she breathed very carefully and very deliberately for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "Tell me everything you know about soul bonds, and how they work, and what they require. Everything. Not the version where you manage the information to prevent me from being alarmed. Everything. That will take more than one evening," he said. "I am not going anywhere," she said. And then, because she always did, "Tell me." She met with Counselor Amber the following week, and they began the work. Not loudly. Not with the kind of dramatic confrontation that makes for good narrative, but bad governance. With documentation, with patience, with the slow and unglamorous process of dismantling something that has had 300 years to settle into institutional bedrock. Kyle listened to her descriptions of every session, every negotiation, every moment of frustrated progress, through the bond that had settled between them like a conversation that had simply never stopped. He could not intervene directly. He was not there in any way, the council chamber could perceive, but he had 3 centuries of watching power operate, and he had opinions, carefully offered, that Serafina found more strategically useful than anything the reform literature she had been reading could provide. The Omega reclassification reform passed in the following year. Imperfectly, with compromises she resented and provisions that would need revisiting. But it passed, and Serafina, sitting in the old temple on the evening of the vote, told Kale about it, with the specific satisfaction of someone who has done something that mattered in full knowledge of its imperfection. And he said, "This is how things change. Not all at once. Not cleanly. This is how it happens." And she knew he was right, because he had watched it not happen for 3 centuries and knew exactly what it cost. The seal held, the corruption, with the bond reinforcing it, and the influence it had cultivated slowly being dismantled above, was quieter than it had been in decades. Kale still maintained it, still pressed against its edges from the inside, still carried the weight of the anchor that he had carried for 3 centuries. But the weight was different now. It was not the weight of isolation. It was the weight of something shared, something chosen, something that had a person on the other side who would be in the temple every evening with her thermos and her questions and her honesty, choosing this, choosing him, with the fully open eyes of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had decided it was worth it. She always said goodnight before she left. She always said it the same way she had said it for 6 years, as the last thing before the door, the small ritual that had become, in its repetition, the most real thing she knew how to offer. And every evening, in the voice that was almost a voice now and growing more so, he said it back, not as a legend addressing his devoted, as a person speaking to the one who knew him best and had chosen, in full knowledge, to stay. Good night, Serafina. Good night, Kale. And the city went on around them, complicated and imperfect, and more honest than it had been. Its oldest foundations finally given the care they had been denied for 300 years, healing in the slow, patient way that only real things heal. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below and share this with someone who needs a reminder that being truly known is worth waiting for. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Until next time.